today we are on Canto 3, Chapter 21, Text 5. And this chapter is called Conversation Between Manu and Kardama, Chapter 21 of 3rd Canto. Okay, so this gets the setup of how eventually Kardama Muni will be married to Devahūti. So this is our verse. Ruchiryo Bhagavan Brahman Ruchiryo Bhagavan Brahman Dakshova Brahmana Sutaha Dakshova Brahmana Sutaha Yatasa Sarja Bhutani Yatasa Sarja Bhutani Labdha Bharyam Chamanavim Labdha Bharyam Chamanavim Ruchiryo Bhagavan Brahman Dakshova Brahmana Sutaha Yatasa Sarja Bhutani Labdha Bharyam Chamanavim Ruchiryo Bhagavan Brahman Mam Sutaha Yatasa Sarja Bhutani Labdha Bharyam Chamanavim Ruchiryo Bhagavan Brahman Dakshova Brahmana Sutaha Yatasa Sarja Bhutani Labdha Bharyam Chamanavim Ruchiryo Bhagavan Brahman Dakshova Brahmana Sutaha Yatasa Sarja Bhutani Labdha Bharyam Chamanavim. Vaishnavis. Ruchiryo Bhagavan Brahman Dakshova Brahmana Sutaha Yatasa Sarja Bhutani Labdha Bharyam Chamanavim Ruchiryo Bhagavan Brahman Dakshova Brahmana Sutaha Yatasa Sarja Bhutani Labdha Bharyam Chamanavim Ruchi Yaha Who Bhagavan Worshipful Brahman O holy sage Dakshaha Daksha Va and Brahmanaha of Lord Brahma Sutaha the son Yatha in what way Sasarja generated Bhutani offspring Labdha after securing Bharyam as their wives Cha and Manavim the daughters of Svāyambhuva Manu So here is the translation. O holy sage, tell me how the worshipful Ruchi and Daksha, the son of Brahma, generated children after securing as their wives the other two daughters of Svāyambhuva Manu. So we can do this responsively. O holy sage, tell me how the worshipful Ruchi and Daksha, the son of Brahma, generated children after securing as their wives the other two daughters of Svāyambhuva Manu. So here is the purport by Srila Prabhupada. All the great personalities who increase the population in the beginning of creation are called Prajapatis. Brahma is also known as a Prajapati, as were some of his later sons. Svāyambhuva Manu is also known as a Prajapati, as is Daksha, another son of Brahma. Svāyambhuva had two daughters, Akuti and Prasuti. The Prajapati Ruchi married Akuti, and Daksha married Prasuti. These couples and their children produced immense numbers of children to populate the entire universe. Vidura's inquiry was, how did they beget the population in the beginning? So, Ruchiryo Bhagavan Brahman Dakshova Brahmana Sutaha Yatasa Sarja Bhutani Labdha Bharyam Chamanavim. O holy sage, tell me how the worshipful Ruchi and Daksha, the son of Brahma, generated children after securing as their wives the two daughters of Svāyambhuva Manu. As we were saying a minute ago, this section of Bhagavatam will wind its way around to describing how Kardama Muni has a material desire, and eventually Kardama Muni approaches through prayer the Supreme Lord, and after praying to the Supreme Lord, the Lord answers his prayer, and Svāyambhuva Manu is prompted to give to Kardama Muni his daughter. So Svāyambhuva Manu and his wife Shatarupa have 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. The 2 boys are Priyavrata and Uttanapad, and the 3 girls are Prasuti, Akuti, and Devahūti. So, in this part of Bhagavatam, we are particularly concerned with how Devahūti will wind up being the wife of Kardama Muni. And of course, what will happen is that Kapila Dev will be born. And Kapila Dev is a direct expansion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And he will speak Sāṅkhya Philosophy, which we will hear in Canto 4. So that's kind of what's on the agenda for future Bhagavatam. But we have the rest of the family too here. We have the fact that Svāyambhuva Manu, who was produced from Brahma, actually Svāyambhuva Manu and his wife Shatarupa were produced at the same time from Brahma, and they became husband and wife, and they produced these 5 children. And from these 5 children, many, many offspring will be eventually generated. At this point, the universe is not full of population. That will happen as everything unfolds. So the Kapila Dev that will speak Sāṅkhya philosophy is actually the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but he is not to be confused with a later atheistic Kapila, who will also speak Sāṅkhya philosophy, but it will not be transcendental philosophy. It'll be mundane philosophy. So we will discover that there are 6 what are called darshans, darshans, and these are the various views or approaches to the Vedic literature, and we were discussing them briefly last night, that we have Nyaya, which is logic, then there is Vaisheshika philosophy, which is atomism, then there is what's known as Sāṅkhya philosophy. The original Sāṅkhya was spoken by Kapila Dev, but the bogus later Sāṅkhya was spoken by the bogus Kapila Dev. And then we have the yoga philosophy by Jaimini, and then, not Jaimini, but by Patanjali. And then we have the Karma Mimamsa philosophy by Jaimini, and finally Vedanta Darshan by Vedavyas. So anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked there. But we learned earlier in this chapter, so we're just at 5 verses in, but we learned earlier that Ruchi and Daksha will marry Akuti and Prasuti, respectively. So Ruchi will marry Akuti, and Daksha will marry Prasuti. And from Daksha will come, a bunch of descendants. And Daksha is known for being very expert. But what is he expert in? He's expert at producing children, which is, I guess needed at this time, but it's more of a materialistic capacity. What we will also learn about in 3rd canto and 4th canto and in 5th canto as well, we will pick up the other members of the family. We will learn about Priyavrata and Uttanapad. And so Priyavrata was the eldest son of Satarupa and Svāyambhuva Manu. So the eldest son is usually the one that takes over the kingdom. So Svāyambhuva Manu, who is considered to be, in some senses, the first human being, and the Manus are important in organizing humanity. That's their role in the universe, and there are progressively 7 of them. So in a Day-of-Brahma, which is known as a kalpa, there are 7 different Manus. We are now in the 7th Manu, so we are halfway through the lot. And the first one was Svāyambhuva. We are presently in Vaivasvata Manu, which is the Manu that's living at our present time. But this is way back in Manu number 1, in Svāyambhuva Manu, which is a Manu where creation is just getting off the ground for a particular day of Brahma. So each Manu has, throughout his life, he lives for 71 Divya Yugas, or complete Yuga cycles. So we have Satya Yuga, followed by Treta, followed by Dvapara, followed by Kali. And those 4 are like 4 seasons, except for Satya Yuga is 4 times as long as Kali, and Treta is 3 times as long as Kali, and Dvapara is twice as long as Kali. So it's like having 4 seasons, but winter is the longest one, or something like that, And then you move to the next one, and it's shorter, and the next one is shorter, and finally fall is the shortest one of the whole bunch. So it's something like that. And when you put all 4 of these yugas together, it's called a Divya Yuga, and 71 of those make one lifetime of a Manu. So 14 times 71 is approximately 1,000. So this 1,000 ages is Brahma's one day. And there's also a similar 1,000 ages of Brahma's one night, but there's nothing going on at Brahma's night. There's no Manus, nothing. It's just zero. So when Brahma's asleep, the whole show is closed down. So this is the first Manu, Svāyambhuva Manu. And when Priyavrata is generated, he becomes a disciple of Narada Muni. And Narada Muni preaches to him, and Priyavrata becomes convinced he doesn't really want to become involved in the process of generating progeny. This is a theme that seems to go throughout the process of unfolding of creation. We have Prajapatis, those who are supposed to create creation, various kinds of creatures, but they seem reluctant to do that task. And in this case, this is what happens to Priyavrata. Although he's the oldest son, he decides, because of his connection with Narada Muni, he goes to the forest to meditate. And he's performing austerities and chanting. And in the forest, he is disconnected from everything else. So Uttanapad, who is the second son, actually is promoted there to being the ruler of the universe. So it's supposed to be Priyavrata, but Priyavrata detaches, and instead Uttanapad becomes the ruler of the universe. And we know Uttanapad will have 2 children. One of them will be Dhruva by Suniti, and of course Uttam by Suruchi. And that will be a whole episode in itself. That's coming up in Bhagavatam, that Dhruva will be insulted when his stepmother Suruchi scolds him for trying to get on the lap of his father. So that will happen. And then eventually Dhruva will become very glorious. And so that's a whole story that's yet to come in Bhagavatam. That's part of the family. After some time, in the line of Uttanapad, we have the Prachetas. And we have Daksha. Now we just heard about Daksha. He married Prasuti. But we know that later there's a story where Shiva and Daksha will have a falling out. Daksha will insult Lord Shiva, and eventually the insult will become a war between Shiva and Daksha, and Daksha will be killed in the eventual outcome of that. But Daksha will take birth again in the family of Uttanapad under the Prachetas. And so we have, first we have Priyavrata. Priyavrata goes to the forest, not going to engage in creating progeny. Then we have Uttanapad taking the throne. Uttanapad has 2 children. One of them is Dhruva. The other one, Uttam, is he dies in a forest fire. So, and his mother then also, Suruchi, dies in the fire as well. And they're killed by a yaksha. So eventually Dhruva fights a whole battle against the yakshas. And later, they're the Prachetas as we go down that line. And then after the Prachetas, Daksha again, who has incarnated a second time. And this Daksha is supposed to take the ruling of the universe. But this Daksha, the second Daksha, decides that he wants to get back his mystic potencies that he had in the previous incarnation as Daksha. So he leaves to go to the forest. And so that leaves the control room empty. There's nobody to manage the universe. So what happens is that Svāyambhuva Manu tries to convince Priyavrata, who's still performing austerities, to come back and take up the kingdom. But Priyavrata doesn't want to do it. So Svāyambhuva Manu goes to his father, Brahma, and Brahma comes to Priyavrata and he says, "My dear Priyavrata, I know that you are very focused on spiritual life. You don't want to become involved in managing a kingdom. You don't want to become involved in begetting children, but this is the necessity. I am Brahma, I am the first creature in the universe, and I had to create children. And, your father, Svāyambhuva Manu, had to create children too. Because there's no ruler, you have to take up the office of being the ruler of the universe." So Priyavrata agrees, and Brahma blesses him that he will not become entangled in material life by taking this position and by becoming a householder. So Priyavrata does this. And he has children by, he has two wives. One of them isn't named, but the other is. Barhishmati, that's what his wife's name is. So Priyavrata marries Barhishmati, and he has 10 sons from Barhishmati. 3 of them become sannyasis, and they take up the renounced order, but 7 of them are sons that will take up the ruling of the earth plane. He also has 3 sons by his other wife, and they become the next Manus. Not the next ones, they become 3, 4, and 5. So Tamish, and there's another 2, I don't remember the names, but they become Manu number 3, Manu number 4, and Manu number 5. And now the 7 sons that Priyavrata are descended from him. He wants to divide the earth planet, or the Bhumandala, among these 7 children. So what does he do? We have the whole unfolding of the universe, and at this point we have the sun, which is seated on a chariot driven by Aruna, and it goes around, and so there's day and night. But Priyavrata was so powerful, he had many mystic potencies from having spent all that time doing various austerities, that he didn't like the fact that sometimes things were light and sometimes things were dark. So he thought that I'll make a second son, and there will be no darkness, and he'll have a chariot like that. And the way that it works is that the chariot of the sun has one axle on Mount Sumeru and the other at the very edge of the universe. And so it goes around in a circle with one wheel not moving and the other one going all around the edge of the universe. And Priyavrata thought, I will do exactly a similar thing. But he expands himself. And in one expansion, he's managing the universe. And in another expansion, Priyavrata gets on 7 chariots, and each one is a little longer than the previous one, and the one wheel is pivoted on Mount Sumeru, and then it goes out a certain distance, and it makes a ridge when it goes around, and he drives another chariot slightly bigger, and goes around a little farther away, but the wheel is wider too. And then the next chariot goes out a little further from there, and the wheel is wider than that. And this is how the dvipas are created. You know, the earth is in Bhumandala, divided into 7 islands and 7 bodies of water. These bodies of water are circular, and they surround each island, and each island is surrounded by yet another island, and it's larger and larger and larger. And this was done so that his 7 children that did not become sannyasis could each have one of these dvipas, so each one is given to one. And they were all named after various expansions of the fire god, Agni. So they were Agnidra, Idmajiva, Yagyabahu, Hiranyareta, Grita Prishta, Medatiti, and Vitihotra, I think are the names. So that's where we have these Kranchadweep, Plakshadweep, Jambudweep, all these 7 islands. And these are not to be confused with the 7 continents that we have, although there is a relationship, at least on some kind of level, between the continents that we see on this planet and Bhumandala, which is the flat representation of the earth plane, the entire thing. And this was why Priyavrata performed this austerity. So he created these rings, and eventually he gave all of his 7 sons one of these islands. So this is the story as we go from, Priyavrata's side. And later on, Priyavrata will have very many important descendants, so that's also a part of the story. So we are hearing here that in the first verse, was it here? Vidura said, in the line of Svāyambhuva Manu, was most esteemed, O worshipful sage, I beg you give me an account of this race, whose progeny multiplied through sexual intercourse. So Vidura is asking Maitreya about this line coming from Svāyambhuva Manu. So now we've talked about, these various descendants. We've talked about Priyavrata, we've talked about Uttanapad, we didn't really talk much about Akuti and her husband Ruchi, but there were a couple of very important children that come from that family. I don't remember their names right now. And then, of course, Daksha and Prasuti, they had many children, and there's a whole story there too. And then we talked about Devahūti, which is the story that we're focused on now. Devahūti will eventually be given in marriage to Kardama Muni. And Kardama Muni is a direct expansion of Brahma. We learn about that in, I think, 2nd canto or 3rd canto, somewhere. It explains, I think it's in 3rd canto earlier, that Brahma is creating progeny from his body. And from the shadow of Brahma comes Kardama Muni. So that's Kardama Muni. And then later, he will marry Devahūti. Devahūti will serve Kardama Muni very wonderfully for many years, but Kardama Muni will eventually be asked by her to create children, and they will have Kapila Dev, who will be the giver of Sāṅkhya Philosophy. And they will also have daughters, and these daughters will also become generators of various progeny as well. So this is how the universe gradually gets filled up. So we have various expansions, various kings, various... in the beginning, many of these expansions or many of these new beings coming into the universe were generated directly from the body of Lord Brahma. But later on, as is mentioned in this chapter, that sexual intercourse will be the normal way that new beings are brought into the universe. All right. So, any questions about any of that? Can we get the official microphone so that...
very patiently explained the lineage. Thank you, Maharaj. Maharaj, this Daksha and this Daksha is the father-in-law of Lord Shiva?
What's that?
This Daksha is the father-in-law of Lord Shiva? Is he the father-in-law of Lord Shiva?
The what of Lord Shiva?
Father-in-law. Father-in-law.
Yeah, right. He's the father-in-law of Lord Shiva. So this Daksha is the Daksha that will wind up neglectfully or hesitatingly giving his daughter Sati to Shiva in marriage, and he will eventually insult Lord Shiva when there is a fire yajna coming up, as we see that actually, according to one point of view, Daksha has Shiva as a son-in-law because Shiva marries Daksha's daughter. So in that consideration, we can consider that Shiva is Daksha's son-in-law. However, Shiva is the second generated being from Lord Brahma, way before Daksha. So in that sense, he's elder or senior to Daksha. But Daksha chose to see it from the other point of view. And so therefore, when Daksha came into the assembly, incredibly full of himself and puffed up on egoistic pride, he noticed that Shiva did not do anything special. He didn't have to. Lord Shiva was actually senior to him. But then he spoke against Shiva and decided to have a second sacrifice where he would invite all the demigods but conspicuously omit inviting Shiva. And of course, although Shiva was not invited, his wife Sati wanted to go because it was her family. Daksha is, after all, her father, and she hadn't seen her mother and her sisters in a long time, so she wanted to go. Shiva cautioned her that this would not be a good move, that she would not be respected. Of course, she went anyway, and when she came into the house, her, father was engaged in this huge sacrifice with all the demigods except Lord Shiva being invited. And then Daksha didn't pay any attention to her because she was the wife of Shiva. So she became very angry, and as a result, she sat down in meditation and caused the fire element to burst out and emulated herself because she was so disgusted at having some family relationship with Daksha that she wanted to end her relationship with Daksha by committing suicide. So she gave up her body as Sati, but then she again became born as the daughter of the Himalayas, and that's why she's known as Parvati. And she again becomes the wife of Lord Shiva. So There was a period of time where she gives up her body, and then later on she comes again in a different family, so she's no longer connected with Daksha. And of course, after Sati immolates herself, then there are demons who come to desecrate the sacrifice of Daksha. And there's a whole war that goes on, and eventually Daksha is beheaded in that sacrifice. And then, eventually, as we see, he comes back again as in the line of the Prachetas. So we kind of see some entities very peacefully trying to perform Krishna consciousness in a pure state, and we see those who are trying to engage in spiritual life, but they have many materialistic motivations, so they make big mistakes. Yes, because they won't hear you and the recording.
So Prachetas, that is this Manvantara is Svāyambhuva Manu.
Yes.
Then he takes birth in the lineage of Dhruva to Prachetas. That's a different Manvantara.
Well, later on, yeah, I think that this is a whole series of time. I'm not exactly sure what the timeline is there, whether it's a different Manu or not. It may be by that time a different Manu.
I mean, Daksha was taking more or less birth in the same lineage, actually,
That what?
He's taking birth in the same family, more or less, because Dhruva and Prachetas are connected to Dhruva.
Right.
But that's a different Manvantara.
Right.
So, till this day, until you explained, I didn't realize, he's from the same family, but again, down the line, he was taking birth from the same family.
Right.
And the Manvantara changed, so that many years passed, because that's a question actually.
Yeah. I don't know exactly how to answer that question. There's, when you hear these accounts, they give certain information, and there's also some information that's not given. What's interesting, actually, I was listening to a very nice set of tapes that are done by a devotee in Australia named Ganesham Govinda, and he explains this whole unfolding of the universe. He's talking about the whole astrological and astronomical system. And he says, why do we in Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam hear so much about the creation of the universe? It seems like such a mundane concept. But he says, actually, the reason Sukadeva Goswami explains this to Parikshit is that when you hear about the creation of the universe, one of the things you notice is that wherever you are in the universe, there's some version of the Supreme Lord there, so he's everywhere. And the Supreme Lord has come to the universe to kindly pop his face out and try to somehow or other entice us to go back home, back to Godhead, even though we are completely not interested in that. We want to enjoy the material world. We have our material sense gratification, and it is so cool that we just want to stay here, But the Supreme Lord comes and says, well, why don't you want to try to come back? Actually, you won't be happy enjoying material sense gratification. We go, no. I will be happy enjoying material sense gratification. It is what I want to do. All right, enjoy your sense gratification. And we do, and we get kicked by Maya again and again. And we find out that sense gratification is sour and bitter and has all kinds of problems. But takes many of us long time to learn that lesson, But nevertheless, we hear that whether you're in Plakshadweep or Jambudweep or whatever Varsha you're in Jambudweep, there is some manifestation of the Supreme Lord there. And he is worshipped by a certain group of people, and usually there is a main worshiper and so on and so forth. So we'll hear this in Bhagavatam that, we contrast this to the scientific view, where you have a rock floating around a sun in the backwater of some forgotten, constellation of stars in a galaxy, and there's no reason why it's there. There's no purpose in its creation. We don't know where it's going, other than everything's going to explode and everybody will burn down at some point. That much we know. So, what kind of a view is that? What's the purpose behind that? What is there to look forward to in that? Why would you want to deliver yourself in that view? Must be that things are so bad that, find whatever sense gratification that you can find close by and kind of go for that, because, eventually everything's going to blow up and burn down. So might as well just enjoy some sense gratification while you can. So this is how different the modern, so-called enlightened scientific view is, because it leaves out what we care about the most, what human beings are for, what we really want, how our desires are really fulfilled, what makes a human being feel satisfied. Other questions?
Raj, I was just thinking about this point in many different sections of the Bhagavatam. So many genealogical tables are given. This many daughters and this and this king. And I was just, maybe if you can let us know the reason. What's the reason behind this? Why do we have to hear so many names? And
right.
This daughter came from this and like that.
Well, I would respond to why we hear all these different names. That we find that Srila Vyasadeva, he had written the 4 Vedas. And then, he wrote the Puranas and the Upanishads. And then his students expanded the Vedas in many different ways. But he thought that in Kali Yuga, the people of Kali Yuga are so dull-minded that they won't be able to follow this philosophy. So he thought to weave the philosophy into stories. And so he decided to write the Mahabharata. So the Mahabharata is a huge story. And in the telling of these human beings, and also to some extent there's demigods involved as well, in telling these stories, we find that we can relate to philosophy much easier when it's intertwined with actual narratives of real people's lives. That's how it really sits and figures into our consciousness. So this same technique is there in Bhagavatam. We have all these stories of different individuals. And, some of them we see are people who are very perfected. We see stories of people who really were doing the wrong thing. We see stories about people who were trying to do the right thing but veered off the mark in some kind of way. And because these are stories, and these stories interact with one another, we can see various levels of spiritual attainment, how people with a different spiritual level of advancement have certain results to their actions and their flow of life, and those who don't have different reactions to their flow of life. And usually, because we're talking about devotional service, that's the main key thing here, that even those who are doing it wrong usually become, as time goes on, a little bit better off, and eventually they become, devotees. So we see a very complex world, and in the explanation of Sukadeva Goswami, he explains that there is no possibility of describing this material universe fully. It's beyond comprehension. However, we can describe certain things about it. So that's what we do. And that's the interesting nature of the Supreme, that he makes this material world so complicated, so complex, that if we try through our feeble intellect to just cut it up into little pieces and try to sew it back together and see how it ticks, we will never come to any real understanding of anything. However, if we surrender to the Supreme, we won't know everything about the universe, but we will know some things about it. And through trying to come in contact with these various stories of different individuals, some of them doing the right thing, some of them doing almost the right thing, then we will be purified by this process, and we will learn how to focus on the Supreme. So each day there's a new newspaper coming out. Of course, people don't really read newspapers much these days. However, each day on the internet you have the equivalent of a newspaper coming out with new things, usually stupid things happening in the world, and we read about it. So similarly in Bhagavatam, if we really get into the Bhagavatam, we see how there are so many stories to absorb your mind. And by thinking about each story, the mind has a tendency to want to follow a narrative of a particular individual as they go through various episodes in life. Since that tendency is there, when we utilize that tendency in coming in contact with devotees of the Lord, almost devotees of the Lord, or the Supreme and his own various pastimes, then in all those cases we become purified just by that intellectual activity of trying to, come in contact. And, everything is connected to Krishna in some way or another. And it's by trying to understand how everything is connected to Krishna that we can come more and more deeply into the rock-solid feeling that we're not missing out on anything and there's nothing missing. And then if we just follow this process, we'll go back home, back to Godhead. We'll get out of this place. Any other quick questions? Yes.
Thank you, Maharaj, for the nice class. I was just thinking, it's so interesting to hear this lineage of all these different people, and it looks like they all had a purpose. We see it maybe after some time. Right. And I'm just curious, did they know that they have such a purpose when they were born? Something like
what?
That? Like, did they know already, like, why they were born? Or basically, like, if, when they had kids, right? They were thinking, oh yeah, they will become Manus, they will become kings, or something like that. And we see, even in this time, that not all of them wanted to fulfill their purpose. I believe it was Priyavrata, right, who didn't want to beget children and things like that. And I guess my question is, do we have a purpose? We're not as big, obviously, as these people were, but how to go about this?
Yeah. Well,
which we don't know yet.
We all have a purpose, and that is to bring people to Krishna consciousness in some kind of way. That's the Sankirtan Yajna. So exactly how to do that. This is the interesting thing, that even if we look at the original beings in the universe, it wasn't exactly clear to Brahma what he needed to do. He was there. He gets born on the lotus flower. It's dark. It's windy. And he's thinking, what am I doing here? So it wasn't clear exactly. But when he performed penance, then the Supreme Lord revealed in his heart what he needed to do. And I think it's something like that. However, when we see that the Manus are born, Svāyambhuva Manu and Shatarupa, his wife, that in this case, they're learning their purpose to some extent from Brahma. He's telling them what they're supposed to be doing, or at least the idea is there that now we have the physical part of the universe created, but we don't have beings yet. So, as Prabhupada calls them, he calls them all Prajapatis. These are the beings that kick off the many generations, of beings that we have in the universe now. We see that, as Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, that the living entities are sarvagata, they're all pervading. Everywhere you go, they're living beings. You look anywhere and there's some little bug or cockroach or something floating around in there looking out at you, trying to hide, and there's beings in all various planets, in spite of the fact that, to our telescopes it looks like they're just rocks with holes in them, that there's beings there. We may or may not be able to see them, but some kind of beings are everywhere. So the entire universe is populated, and the purpose of the universe is to give us a chance to either ignore God or pay attention to God, as we choose. And for those of us who want to pay attention to God, then the next step is to help to bring others to that process of paying attention to God, which we call bhakti yoga. So how exactly we will do that, and to me it seems like each one of us has some conceivable, unique way that we could do that, of bringing people to Krishna consciousness. And I look at devotees who are endeavoring in doing that, and they do so in a number of different ways. So there are, of course, ways we do it collectively. It's not that we ignore the ways that we're doing it collectively, but individually, too, we have this kind of ability to pioneer in some new way to bring Krishna to others. And if it works out, great. Or maybe the way that we bring people to Krishna is by following one of the ways that already exists. We don't necessarily have to invent a new way. That's how I would respond. All right, so thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.